Just starting the recording. A warm welcome to everybody who's come today. I'm Esther Forgan in Evaluation Unit. A warm welcome to the session on remote sensing in impact evaluations, a session that's been organised jointly between Evaluation Unit and the FCDO Data Hub, and using the resources from the Evaluation Unit's programme, the Centre for Excellence for Development, Impact and Learning, a program which is innovating in impact evaluations and evidence synthesis, trying to get the new ideas into our evidence that we use in our programming and our policies. This is on remote sensing, which I hope you know has loads of potential to increase the amount we know about forests, vegetation, crops, water, air quality, buildings and infrastructure at a relatively low cost and a very timely way. One practicalities before I hand you over to the presenter. We are recording the event and the recording of the event will be available externally. So to let you know that by speaking, you are giving your consent for this to be shared. Wanted to make sure you're all very clear on that so you can make your choices around there. But at this point, I'm about to hand you over to our presenter, who is Ayush Malik, who is a data science associate for the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, and he will manage the session, including time for Q&A, and then we'll close the session with Tim Harris from the FCDO Data Hub. But very exciting session, and Ayush, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Esther, for that, and I thank you all for joining the session. And it's a really, as Esther mentioned, it's a really exciting space that we find ourselves in. And I'm really excited to be here with you all to present the possibilities of remote sensing for impact evaluations. So this session will be these workshops are divided into two sessions. The first of one is today, and the second one will be day after tomorrow. The first one will be more general, where we talk about what the challenges, what the opportunities, what kind of things there are that are related to remote sensing, what the evaluators need to know, and so on. Whereas the second session will be more hands-on, where we will have a discussion on how to access, source, find, download the satellite images, and then how to use Google Earth Engine using Python programming language. It's more getting your hands dirty with the actual code. So I welcome you all over here. A little bit about me. I am Ayush Malik, as you all know now, and I've been working on some interesting stuff at 3IE for a couple of months now, including machine learning for program evaluation. And I have a background in statistics and entrepreneurship, and I have a professional experience working in remote sensing, machine learning, and data analytics. I primarily use Python for my work, and I'm interested in the applications of artificial intelligence at the intersection of program evaluation and data science. Few logistical information before we start. You can ask questions. It's easier if you put in your question right when you have it, because sometimes if you wait for the time to open your questions up, it can just vanish from your mind. So whenever you have a question, just write it there in the chat. My colleagues from 3IE will be helping me to moderate the questions. There will be time for discussion where people can share their experiences, their insights, and the next steps that they think are important for using remote sensing in their work. You can use chat function. You could also unmute and ask questions if you think that's that's easier for you. The presentation will be downloaded and sent to you. I guess Jenna will be helping you with that. I will also share the tutorial link with you, which I think is already shared, but you will not need it for today's presentation, as well as there will be supplementary material that will be shared with you after the session second is over. Agenda for this will be divided into several parts. The first is what is remote sensing. So we'll understand what remote sensing is, what are active and passive sensors, what is differentiated reflection, how it is important. Then we'll talk about the benefits of remote sensing, how remote sensing is helpful for program evaluation. Then the challenges that are associated with remote sensing, because there's always pros and cons of several things. Then we'll also talk about when not to use remote sensing for the work, and the ethical considerations that one needs to keep in mind while they are thinking of using remote sensing in their work. Our intended outcomes from these workshops are that after attending these workshops, you will be able to do three things. The first one of which is understand what is remote sensing, how it works, and why it is relevant for use in impact evaluation. The second thing is we'll be talking about the benefits and the challenges that are associated with this process, and also talk about the key ethical and practical considerations in terms of the questions that the teams should be asking themselves before they decide that they should be using remote sensing for their work. However, as I informed earlier, the second session will be more hands-on and it will cover the practical aspects such as finding the sources of satellite data, downloading it, clipping to the area of intervention, to the administrative boundaries as well, how we can calculate relevant geographical indices, and then exporting those values, which can further be put as an input to the econometric models if warranted to by the research questions. And we'll understand this all with the help of a case study, which is a 3i study that's been done earlier. All right, so I would like to start the session by asking you a question. What comes to your mind when you hear the words remote sensing and satellite imagery? My colleague has entered a link. If you could go over there and enter what comes to your mind. You have a minute to do so. You could alternatively go to menti.com and use the code 22575019 to code in your response. Thank you, Jane. Yes. All right, then thank you so much for keying in your responses. And the kind of responses that I'm seeing over here are pictures of the globe, Google Earth, geospatial, night lights, lots of data, of course, and satellites, technology, military, raster, geospatial analysis, agricultural projects, landscape. And the thing that comes up quite a lot is maps, LiDAR, looking at forest area. Google comes up again. So I think Google Maps, yes, you have a fairly good idea of what this all will involve. So yes, geospatial data will be there. You will be using it with the Google Maps. A lot of people use Google Maps because Google offers the kind of resolution that is free for a lot of analysis. Then plants and vegetation are also important. Topography is important for this all as well. So I'm really glad that this audience has a good understanding of geospatial analytics as well as what remote sensing and satellite imagery mean. I will start with an illustrative example. So this is a 3i funded study that was done in around 2020. And the research question at hand was that they wanted to understand and they wanted to evaluate the impact that infrastructure development has in a particular area. So they use the case study of Konkan Railway. If you are familiar with geography of India, Konkan Railway is made up in the Western Ghats, which is western part of Indian subcontinent. It is a biodiversity. It's a very biodiverse region, and the research was done using census and satellite data, and then they had some questions on what has been the effect of the infrastructure on the Konkan Railway. So the question that comes up is, why did they use satellite imagery? Why not anything else? And there are three things we identified why they use satellite imagery. The first is that it was a retrospective evaluation. And the concern at hand was that we wanted to understand the long long-term impact, because the railways was constructed in around 90s and the study was done in 2020s. So they wanted to see how the impact has been over the years. Also, they wanted to see how the land use has changed, and satellite medium provided to be the best medium to understand that. And then they decided to have the differences approach to measure these infrastructure outcomes. The way they decided it by dividing it into treatment and control groups. The treatment was the area which was around the railway line, and the control was a similar geographical area that was around 10 kilometers away from the railway line, to see how they both have evolved over those years. And then they could see the kind of impact that was there in and around the Konkan region. So that is why they used satellite imagery for this. Why is this relevance for you? So taking the previous example and breaking it into parts, we see that there are various steps that are involved while doing impact evaluation. So they took these steps and then saw how they can use satellite imagery for those areas. For example, in the problem diagnosis, they wanted to understand the impact, long-term impact of infrastructure development. Then the theory of change and the program design required them to look at the geographical variability over the period. Then the key evaluation questions was the question that I shared earlier, the infrastructure development, evaluating that part. The method that they used was the DIT method, and the resources and logistics so that they had satellite imagery to do that. And this is the possible applications on the right-hand side that you see of remote sensing for those areas. For example, in the resource and logistics, you could say that there is a potential for saving time and cost, because you can capture quite a large area at such a short span of time to see how it has evolved over a period of time. And it also allows us to see larger areas, ask special questions that are important for the research questions at hand. So this is a slide that wants to put forward the point that remote sensing as an approach can be incorporated at all the stages of an impact evaluation process. All right, then. So the question that comes up is, what is remote sensing? If we divide the word remote sensing in two parts, you could say remote means not touching, means being far away, and sensing is measuring something without coming in touch. Thus, remote sensing is the process of measuring something using some instruments which are not in contact with the object that they are measuring. There are various ways of doing remote sensing. There are geosynchronous satellites. Then there are sensors which are aboard the International Space Station. There are satellite missions as well. And these days you get did somebody unmute? Somebody want to ask a question? Okay, never mind. So these are there are unmanned aerial vehicles as well, which are used to capture images. However, these are UAVs images, which we normally do not put as satellite imagery. However, they still come under remote sensing because they are remotely capturing something. So that's what remote sensing is. And so remote sensing actually works on two fronts. There are active and passive sensors. So active sensors provide their own energy source for differentiated energy reflection. We'll talk about differentiated energy reflection in a few moments. For example, radar sends out electronic radio waves via the instrument that are there on the images, and then different objects on the planet reflect them on their innate nature, and on the basis of that, the image is captured. However, there are also passive sensors. Passive sensors record the energy that has been reflected from the surface of Earth, but the source of this energy is not from the instrument, but from the suns. The images in this slide will make this more clear. So on the left-hand side, you can see that active sensing, the source of energy is also coming from the device, as well as it's also being captured from the device. However, in the passive sensing, you could see that the source of energy is sun, and then it's being captured by the device that is there. So that's the difference between active and passive sensing. The technology that exists behind remote sensing is electromagnetic spectrum. So various satellite waves come mostly from the infrared and visible light region, and they are used for calculating indices, and they show the various indicators that are helpful for that. So in simple words, one can say that electromagnetic spectrum is the technology that exists behind all of this. How does remote sensing work? A few moments ago, I talked about differentiated reflection. So this is how remote sensing works, that you have a source of light. It could be either sun, or it could be from the device itself. And then you see Some of the objects on Earth have a different nature of reflecting light, and some of the objects on Earth have a very different from the other objects of reflecting light. So on the left, you see there's this healthy plant. It is taking 50% of the energy, and it's absorbing quite a lot and just reflecting back only 8%. However, on the other side, you could see 40% of the energy is taken up, by 30% is reflected back. So on the basis of that, the satellite image is able to say that, okay, this is healthy and this is unhealthy. However, it's not the satellite imagery that gives you a judgment of healthy or unhealthy. It's the indices that use those values that come from various bands of the satellite. And on the basis of that, we make a judgment on whether this is a healthy vegetation or not. I'll take a pause over here and see if there are any questions in the chat. Okay. All right. Thanks, Jane. So I don't think so there are any questions. Now we come to the very important part of this presentation. Why remote sensing? What are the benefits that one gets while they are using remote sensing? Because remote sensing is exciting, but we need to know the concrete benefits it will bring to our program and our projects. The first is improved accessibility to data in hard to access areas. The example that I gave you of Konkan Railways, it is a very forested region of Western India, so it was not very easily accessible, but satellite images allowed to measure things over there without actually getting there. It's a cost-effective measurement for a large area. Just imagine if there was a proposal of going to the forest and then taking measurements and then extrapolating it for a large area. It would be slightly inaccurate, as well as it would be very cost ineffective. Third benefit is that it helps us answer more relevant questions, such as seeing spillover effects in and around geographical intervention areas. Let's say that there is a district X in a country, and we put our intervention over there. But we also want to see that the areas which are around that district can also see the effect of that intervention. So while we are looking at the geography of a place, we'll capture it in our model and a research question and the theory of change that these effects can also be seen in the nearby areas as well. So that's why it's important. The sampling bias is lower, thus we have a more credible identification strategy while using that. Satellite imagery particularly is helpful for calculating vegetation, water, or these days using Sentinel-5P as pollution indices as well, remotely for a larger area. And we could also do program implementation such as rural electrification. If we want to understand how the rural electrification project is being held on the ground, we could see the monitoring of this entire thing remotely using satellite imagery as well. So the place where I live in India, the way they capture illegal construction is using this thing, monitoring program implementation via remote sensing as well. And the last is computer vision plus remote sensing promises to be a very good technology that could be helpful for program targeting. It can help us to know, let's say, where it's more likely that poor people will be located, so that if we have, let's say, a cash transfer program, where we would want to focus our resources on. And it's also helpful. Some of the people are doing some good work on providing grid level estimates of economic development or population estimates or school population using those satellite imagery as well. There's a lot of possibility of using this technology. Some general guidance on when not to use remote sensing. First is that if you think your research question does not include elements of geographic dependence, then just for the sake of it, it's not advised to use remote sensing for your work. The second thing is, which came up during our work with our colleagues and also with the people we were having a conversation with, that doing remote sensing exclusively, even if the context in the research question warrants ground truthing and is possible, it's advised to use remote sensing with ground truthing. However, there will be cases in which going to the ground and actually taking measurements will not be possible. In that case, we have some information from remote sensing. For example, if it's a fragile context in a war-torn country, or it's a very dense vegetation that people cannot get into, then it's helpful if we use remote sensing only. However, the preferred mode is to do the ground truthing along with the remote sensing. And the third thing is measuring what cannot be measured from above. For example, if your context in a research question measures something which cannot be measured from above, for example, if it's about women empowerment, then if your theory of change or the way you're thinking about the intervention includes geographic elements, then yes, it's advised to use remote sensing, but if it doesn't, then it's advised not to use remote sensing on that. So the question that can come up is, how do we know whether these things are happening or not? And the answer to that is that it depends. It depends upon the context. It depends upon the previous researches, and it also depends upon how the theory of change is being constructed for that intervention so that we know whether we need to include the geographic element or not. Next, I come to the challenges that are associated with remote sensing. The first, which we discussed earlier, is ground truthing. Sometimes the images could be misclassified. An example of that is flood irrigation, which is practiced in many areas of the world. Satellite images could give you an impression that it's a flooded area, whereas in actuality, it's an irrigated area that's been irrigated by the farmer. So there's a risk that people can come to the conclusions very fast in case they are not careful. The second thing is understanding the context better. I was reading this in one of the examples written in the CEDIL paper, which Jenna has shared with you earlier as well in the chat. So straw roof are considered to be a signal that the person who is living there in that house may be poor. However, sometimes it's required because we just need to keep the heat out. So that's why it's important to understand the context where you are using remote sensing as well. The second thing is construct validity. You should be very careful, and you should know that the proposed measure actually measures what it claims to be measuring. For example, night light time data in GDP. It's postulated that nighttime light is a very good indicator of GDP as well. So you should know if it's relevant for your question or not. The third is cost. Remote sensing can have cost and labor implications. So many organizations, especially in the global south, may not have the abilities to afford very high resolution satellite images or even the labor that is required to handle those images. So it's a challenge. And works like these help us to offer the free and public technology that is available there and make it open for everybody so that they know how they could use tools such as Google Earth Engine to do the kind of satellite analysis that we will be talking about day after tomorrow. The fourth thing is lack of vector data sets. This is a more technical challenge. If you have past experience working with the satellite imagery, you would know that in many cases, it may not be same that the administrative area is similar to the intervention area where you did your intervention. So if you do not have a vector data set for your intervention area, then the first thing it will be to get a vector data set, which may be available already, or you may need to do it from scratch using various geostatistical software that are available. Then the second last is cloud cover. This can be corrected with radar-based instruments. Sentinel-1 offers that kind of images, but if your research question wants you to look into an area where it's a wet season, then satellite images may not be the best medium to do that. And temporal calibration is something that a lot of people have worked on. So as time passes by, instruments changes, machinery changes, technology changes. So you need to ensure that the images that you are taking from the past. Somebody raised a hand.
Hi, thanks. It's very interesting so far. I just wanted, if you can just say a little bit more about correcting for cloud cover. How easy is it to get the Sentinel, and how effective is it?
Yes, so for Sentinel-2, first, thank you for asking this question. It's a very important question. So there are some machine learning approaches that have been made by researchers that use the machine learning to automatically correct the cloud. However, there are also options for you to only look at those images which had a percentage of cloud. For instance, you could say that I only need images which have 15% or less cloud coverage. So that is an option. For Sentinel-1, you could capture the images from ESA's European Space Agency's website, the Copernicus mission, that would allow you to capture the Sentinel-1 images. And your question was on also on how effective it is for measuring the variables which you're interested in. So Sentinel-1 can measure some things, but not all of the things. For them, if your research question warrants you to have an optical imagery, And if there are clouds, then it may not be the best way to go forward. It's a challenge. Okay. So this is these are some of the questions that we have identified that teams. I hope I was able to answer your question, Theodore Holosa.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thanks. But I may want to talk to you again. I'll speak to Tim to see how I can get out of you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be more than happy if. I mean, it's a point I didn't raise earlier, but right now I'm saying it, that after the presentation, Esther and Tim have my email IDs, so they can get in touch with anybody at the 3i or particularly with me, and then we can always talk more about these possibilities. So that's the option is there. Okay, so the questions that you need to ask before using remote sensing. First disclaimer is that this is not an exhaustive list of questions. There can be many other questions as well. Are there any examples of remote sensing data used for evaluating, for example, impact of any climate mitigation programs on deforestation? This is a very good question, Askar Khatri. And so the challenge especially with climate mitigation programs is that the outcomes are seen very, very distant in the future. So I do not recall any example at the top of my mind right away, but I will note it down in my notes, and then we can get back to Esther and Tim and share the studies that have used remote sensing for this purpose. I'll share them with you. Back to the slide. So the first question is lots of our climate action work seeks to reduce deforestation data. That's hard. This is very helpful. Thank you, Asghar, for sharing that. I will get back to you with the information, with the updated information, and then we can discuss more about it. But I definitely think it's a very interesting area, and it's something that we need to collectively, the whole world needs to collectively work more on it. Thanks. So questions to ask before using remote sensing. Is my variable of interest affected by the spatial dimensions? Do you think that your variable of interest is affected by the spatial dimensions? If yes, then it's good. You gotta use you can use remote sensing in your work. Second is, can these geographical features be measured using satellites? What is the image resolution I need for measuring the variable of interest with a higher precision? Sometimes this is a challenge which we came up when I was working with several colleagues of mine, that in Philippines, the farm sizes were pretty small. So the kind of resolution that was offered by Sentinel was not always very helpful for them. And that's why they needed very high resolution imagery. So while you are discussing your research question, it's helpful for you to know what kind of image resolution you need that can be used for measuring the variable of interest with a higher precision. Is the satellite image available for that region at the resolution I need at that point of time? So we need to also ensure that the satellite images are there. Second, next is, do I need daytime imagery or nighttime imagery? So you could, if your research question wants to include the daytime imagery in the analysis, then it's helpful if you look at the daytime imagery. However, if your research question warrants you to look at the nighttime data, then it's important to look at the nighttime imagery. That's why I want to stress once more on the point that the context, the theory of change, the research question, and the way the research is approaching, they all have repercussions all across the value chain of performing the analysis. That's very important to take a holistic view of the entire thing. Who are the providers of satellite imagery? How do I choose? So two very famous examples of public satellite images are Landsat and Sentinel. Landsat by USGS and then Sentinel by European Space Agency. For private companies, two of the very famous are Planet Earth, Planet Labs and Maxar Technologies. So Maxar is behind Google Maps, the kind of resolution that you see over there. And these are not free products, so one needs to pay for them, and they may not always be accessible in the area. I covered that in the last point as well, but I will cover it here. So when I was doing some analysis coming from India, I was not allowed to have access to Maxar products. So it's also important for you to see the region you come from, whether you are allowed to have access to that imagery directly from the organization. I mean, there could be some alternative arrangements that can be made, but you need to keep that in mind as well. Can I measure my variable of interest at places where there are two distinct dry and wet seasons? This is reinforcing the point we discussed earlier, that if my variable of interest is at a place where there are distinct season, then I need to do some more digging on that. In the case of wet season, can my research question be answered using radar imagery? That's also a question that you could answer. That it's a possibility that your question can be answered by radar imagery, but it can also be a chance that it cannot be answered. How costly getting those images will be. So the public images are free. However, there are still cost implications because you need fast internet connection, you need a space to store all these satellite images, and you need people who can access those images, work on them. So these all are some of the cost and practical implications of using satellite imagery in your work. And do I have the storage capacity? So somebody mentioned in the Mentimeter question that I shared earlier that lots of data. So there is lots. Satellite images are huge. And if you just imagine that I want to do a complete analysis for the whole year for like 10 years, then this warrants you to have storage space in TBs. So that is something that the researcher needs to keep in mind while they're discussing those things. Remote sensing. If it's getting very monotonous for you, I can take a pause, and if there are any questions, we could cover them. But if you think that I can cover first, I can do that as well. I'm pretty much open to the recommendation of the audience. Anyway, there are only 2 slides left, so let me know what you think. Okay, Robbie says good to keep going. All right, then we'll cover a few more points and then I'll get back to the chat questions. I'm really excited to see that there are some comments, really exciting comments as well. Remote sensing and ethical considerations. So this all until now looked very promising and it's all exciting. However, with the satellite imagery, especially any form of imagery warrants some ethical considerations to keep in mind. And with satellites, it's even more complex because you are not taking anybody's permission to capture their backyard. You are there up in the sky and then you take the image. That's why it's more important to keep the ethical considerations. Be very clear and write out specific examples of how this data will be used for the analysis. And where is it that the remote sensing will bring a value to your project and whether the benefit is worth the cost and the endeavor that you are putting into. Acquire consent where relevant and feasible. For example, if you're monitoring private fields and houses of people, it is better to ask them if the consent is possible. Then the extreme privacy of personally identifiable information should be maintained. And in case it's not possible, then all data must be de-identified with either geomasking or blurring simply. If you're capturing images using a UAV, then you should always inform governmental authorities. In case of India, it's important to inform the government before you are using drone cameras because that's not publicly allowed. You just cannot take pictures of anything from sky, especially the government infrastructure projects. It's very important to keep the governmental authorities informed in advance for any kind of work that you are doing. Consider the possible discrimination against the people belonging to a particular region while doing predictive analysis. So that's also important. These considerations I have taken up from ethical considerations when using geospatial technologies for evidence generation. The link is shared in the presentation. When you get that, you can read more. It's a very good report and a pretty helpful one. Esther, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, can you explain the term UAVs? Because I'm not sure that's an abbreviation everybody knows.
Okay, so it's unmanned aerial vehicles. I normally, for my own preference, I just call them as aerial vehicles, but some people want to call them as UAVs. So UAVs means aerial vehicles. It's similar. Drone is an example of aerial vehicle. Yeah, thank you. So 3IE did work in 2020 on an evidence synthesis project called Big Data Systematic Map, which was done in partnership with CEDIL. Over there, we identified what are the areas where big data is being used and what are the promising areas that we think where big data can be used. And we identified a couple of areas, for instance, environmental sustainability, economic development and livelihoods, health and well-being, and urban development. These are the areas where we saw that over the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of research is being done. And these are the promising areas where we could use remote sensing for reaping its benefits. And the use cases could be, we could be either interested in forest cover change, or we could be interested in land use and land change as well. the crop water and air quality measurements can be done. We could also monitor the infrastructure development and generate estimates for poverty. So these are some of the use cases. However, there are also some really exciting things that are coming up, which uses deep learning based technologies, artificial intelligence technologies that can detect the objects. For example, these technologies can take the image of an area and tell you how many houses are there, how many trees are there, what kind of trees are there, how many elephants or trucks are there. And these can be helpful for answering policy questions as well as doing for program evaluation as well. This brings me to my last slide. And with this, I also open the floor for discussion, because until over here, it was a very monotonous thing. I was presenting and you were listening, but now it will be a collective thing. We all will be discussing about this. So the question at hand for the discussion that I found out along with my colleagues were, what are the enabling factors now that will allow you to use remote sensing in your work? Like what can be done organizational wide or technological wide, or in general, what could be done to enable you to use remote sensing in your work?